everyone, and welcome back to the New Earth Lawyer podcast, where we feature lawyers who are changing the practice of law to change the world. My name is Geraldine Johns-Putra. I'm your host. I'm a lawyer. I'm speaking to you from Melbourne, Australia, and this is Boonwurrung country where I'm speaking from. I wish to pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. So welcome to the first episode of season 2. This is 2022. I'm so excited to talk to our guest here today because she's a trained lawyer. She hasn't practiced law, but she is a qualified psychologist, an organisational psychologist. And she's an expert on something that's very meaningful to me, which is the changing nature of work, the connection between our heart and soul on the one hand, and our work. So Emily Knowles, welcome. She is, as I said, a registered psychologist. She's a psychologist, consultant, and researcher at the Human Link in Melbourne, Australia. And one of her favorite perspectives is this interplay between psychology, specifically organizational psychology, and spirituality. She's also national convener of the Buddhism and Psychology Interest Group of the Australian Psychological Society. Welcome, Emily. As I said, I'm looking forward to the conversation we're about to have today.
Thanks, Geraldine. So am I.
Perfect. Now, this really carries on the conversations I was having at the end of last year, the end of season 1, about the nature of work, about how we're changing, how the pandemic and lockdowns have changed us. I see myself as a great example of that. You know, I've gone from working with a large law firm to now working for myself because, you know, through actually working from home during the lockdowns, I realized how satisfied I was with the flexibility, and I felt like it was time to make the leap. And the fact that people have grown more used to working from home, and I can conduct a lot of my meetings over Zoom. And people are not, they're not fazed by the fact that I'm in my home while I'm working. All of that has meant that the move has been a lot more seamless for me. What are you seeing out in the world of work in your profession?
Geraldine, what a timely question and topic. Certainly we're seeing changes, and there's a bit of a narrative at the moment that we've gone from normal to new normal to no normal, which I think is quite interesting now as well. What was normal, if it ever was anything? So I think if we look at that question in the world of work, we can examine it 3 different kind of levels, or in three different ways. How is the work itself changing? How are workers changing? And also how are workplaces changing? So there's kind of 3 dimensions there, if you like. So as you mentioned, the worker is having some new preferences, is seeing and experiencing some different ways of being at work and what it is to be a part of an organisation, a part of a culture, and a part of a team as well that works remotely or sometimes in a hybrid format. In terms of the work itself, we're seeing a division between what's done synchronously and asynchronously, in terms of what's done in a collaborative way online versus in person versus more deep brain thinking time. Depends what industry we're in. We're talking about the legal profession here. So what does that mean? If you're practicing in different areas of law, for example, do you have a firm culture that you are feeling some norms to kind of fit in with? Are there court proceedings that you need to kind of align with, you know, what's going on with the nature of the work? And then the workplace. Organisations are taking really different perspectives and stands on where they want to position themselves in this new, I'm calling it it's like a workplace rather than, it's a workspace rather than a workplace. So it's more a headspace rather than a physical space. And especially with the advent of work from anywhere, and people, I'm based in Melbourne as well, Geraldine, people kind of doing a bit of a tree change or a bit of a sea change, even moving interstate or overseas, that of course will either fit or not fit with your organization's workspace and how they imagine work. So, and then of course there's people who are entrepreneurs and innovators who are doing their own thing and making their own rules up as they go, and really leaning into this flexibility and ambiguity that we do have kind of as a position at the moment. So that's how I'd kind of analyze it at those three layers. Does that make sense, or is that a helpful kind of distinction?
Very helpful framing, thank you. So yeah, I can see where I fit into all of those three things, but particularly that last thing about workspace I like, because I work from home as we've discussed, and I generally work upstairs in my study. But as I said to you before we started recording, I've started working downstairs from my dining table for the summer because I can leave the back door open, and I've got a little dog and he just likes to run in and out. That flexibility of being able to move around, even in my own house, but set up anywhere and feel comfortable and effective and productive working, is something that has developed in the last 2-3 years. I used to be very much office-based and found it very difficult to work anywhere but my desk in the office. So that's an internal thing that's happening to me, but it's being reflected up in what's happening externally. So switching then, that idea of workspace, there's a space in us that's also growing. Maybe that's the worker aspect of it, but I feel like what's changing in the worker is actually impacting the space around them, and I find that really interesting from a psychological and a spiritual perspective, that the changes in us are impacting the spaces around us, and then rippling it out to impact the world.
Yeah, I love where you've taken that in terms of the inner and the outer realities. For me, there's so many ways to answer that. I might answer it from a more kind of scientific way first, because sometimes that gets people over the line. And then we'll go to a little bit more of a spiritual adaptation and translation. So what we know from the research is that environment counts. The environment can impact our well-being. And so well-being is very much one of the subject matter areas that I play in when it comes to organisational psychology, supporting individuals, teams and organisations as three layers of the workplace ecosystem. So when we look at the environment in particular, we've done some inquiry, and when I say we, this is me and my team at Human Link, around the environmental dimension of wellbeing as a specific interplay that contributes to the whole of the wellbeing pie. So if you think of wellbeing comprising of, my intrapersonal elements, so my body and my mind, the things that are within my corporeal kind of control, arguably to different degrees at different times. So that's your intrapersonal. Then you've got your interpersonal, which is that social space, relationships, interactions. And then there's like a third layer, which is a bigger than me piece. And this is where the environment sits, and this is where spirituality also sits. And so the environment piece, we've started to break it down into kind of three ways that the literature and the evidence is starting to converge here. And that is around my space, our space, and then nature. So my space is very much what you were talking about there, Geraldine, the place where you work, how you curate your physical environment, whether that's location in the house, the amount of light, fresh air, music, smell, all the senses, the way you are in your physical proximity. The our space is a little bit more concerned about the collective. So if you share a home habitat with other people, what your community is like, where you live, whether you live kind of in a metropolitan city, whether you live in an isolated kind of location, or whether you are in fact working from the office and what that means. So that's a bit more of the collective. And then natural space is nature. What do you like to kind of be surrounded by when it comes to the elements? Do you like to have greenery within kind of eye shot? Do you like to have birds within earshot? Do you like to be able to walk to the beach on your break? Do you like to be able to get fresh air at the end of the day? Kind of what do you like to, how do you like to interact with nature? And for some of us, and for many of us, we had to get super creative with that during lockdowns because many of us live in apartments and we don't all have that luxury of having a backyard or even a patch of lawn sometimes that we can easily access. So plants, indoor plants, the kind of the deluge of plants. But also I've got a really good friend of mine who's an occupational therapist. So I spoke with her very early about how to set up kind of not just the ergonomics, but optimal light, kind of fresh airflow, all these other elements of what it is when I am feeling like I'm feeling a bit compressed by the nature of a lack of nature. How can we cultivate more of that? And then once lockdowns have eased, I've really integrated more outdoor time and very punctuated and strategic time in that, because the research is there. And anyone will tell you from a more experiential perspective that being in nature is, and grounding is such a wonderful way to feel grounded yourself.
It's what you've mentioned there, which is that integration is, for me, it's the word of the pandemic. You know, it's integration is alignment is one word, but integration is the other. I think we're learning that all parts of ourselves and our environment impact each other, right? And it's dynamic. And it's very hard to pin down, because as soon as we start trying to fix things, then we realize that one part is changed and is causing changes in the other. So that, I love, you know, what you were saying about worker and workplace. We've been talking about that dynamic, the effect that worker has on workplace has on worker. Let's talk about the work. How has the pandemic and lockdown impacted the work we want to do?
I think, or I hope that's a question we're all asking ourselves as well. Like you said, you've been reflecting on it. I have a hope that organisations are kind of turning their mind to the fact that professionals are asking this question. So I guess to break that down a little bit around what type of work or how we engage even with that question. For me, it's really a matter of looking at kind of the, you know, we've had this narrative around the why for a while. You know, why do you do something? You know, Simon Sinek's great TED Talk inspired lots of introspection, I think, and also occupational kind of inquiry when it comes to that question. I think we're moving to a new question though, or two new questions. One is how rather than why. So the how, and then the when. So how do I want to show up with my work? So how do I want to engage with my day? And when do I want to do certain pieces? Now, to start with the latter, actually, when has become such a critical criteria. I'm not sure about in other people's households, but in ours, when we start to lean into that self-managed kind of space, everyone has the same amount of hours in a day, and it's up to us to work out where we optimally work and then to synchronize as we're required to with our workplace. But there's a whole new aspect of what it is to be productive. Are you a night owl? Are you an early bird? Do you need regular breaks? Do you like to get in chunky states of flow? Do you have your Pomodoro technique where you're pausing every 90 minutes? There's so much philosophy, science, there's so many schools of thought that sit there. And so how well do you know yourself? And there's some great kind of blueprints out there to work out when your energy is at optimal rates. So we've got obviously our circadian rhythm, which is our sleep cycle, but we've also got our ultradian rhythm, which is our wake cycle. And so you need to kind of work out when you are at your best to do your best work. And there's some really great research and movements out there around times of day, times of week, even times of month that you should be optimizing for certain types of creative versus due diligence versus collaborative time. So that's the more when do I want to do my work in the way that it's required or the way I want it to. And going back to your question around how do I want to show up? How do I want to be present and be selective? How do I want to meaningfully engage with my to-do list? Well, I would actually argue that the movement that we're progressing towards is a bit more of a to-be list. And so we typically would have a to-do list. We've got our notepad and we've got, this is the critical pathway to achieve all these things, whether it's external deadlines being, kind of court hearings, or internal ones, or kind of more self-imposed kind of momentum-based goals that we've set for ourselves. There is a real shift now moving towards how do we want to be in those tasks? How do we want to be in the day? How do we want to be in our work? And so one of the practices that I've adopted is writing a to-be list at the beginning of the day rather than a to-do list. It depends where you're at with your kind of workflow. I'm fortunate enough that I have an amazing project manager and a team that helped me organize those critical milestones. So they're kind of on a spreadsheet. I know exactly what's happening with those, and I've got a pretty comprehensive diary and calendar mapped out. So look, that's one version of reality. These are the black and white things that need to get done. But how do I want to do them? How do I want to show up for myself and for other people today? Do I want to cultivate an intention of feeling really calm? Do I want to spark others' creativity? And so this to-be list concept is something that I've been really enjoying, Geraldine.
I think that's fascinating because I think I intuitively do it. I, of course, like you said, I've got the notepad with the things that I want to do. But as I'm writing it, I kind of know which ones I'll get to in the day and which ones I know I won't, because it's just not going to be that kind of a day. Maybe it's a big chunky piece of work where I need to set aside 3 hours, and then there are all of these other little things. And it's just that kind of day where I'm going to be maybe in and out. There are lots of errands to run, lots of phone calls. And so I know I'm going to get to all of the little things, but the big chunky one isn't going to happen today. But I put it on my list anyway as a to-do, and it sits there and it kind of nags at me, but I know that I'm going to get to it tomorrow. So if I had that approach, that to-be approach, where tomorrow I've got an afternoon completely free, let's say, I know I could do that chunky piece of work. That is very interesting. But I suppose for me, what immediately came to mind was I could do that now with the flexibility that's built into my work and my work space. How would you do that if you were in a more structured workplace, like a law firm?
Yeah, this is the question, right? This is the tension.
Yeah.
And this is a tension that I've been grappling with. And you know what? I thought it was just going to be me in the legal world, but it's me in the working world more generally. How do you balance out that high octane performance? Things need to get done to the best, highest quality in the fastest possible way. They need to be done fast, they need to be done to a high quality, and they need to be done yesterday kind of piece. And so for me, that tension of feeling the external pressures and the internal pressures that I create there for myself, and that I know others who are have a high ambition drive, others who have some of those other kind of competitive and sometimes perfectionistic kind of qualities to their personality. I think what we really want to focus here on is the nature of the work and the worker. And so what I have been doing some inquiry into here is, how do we feel a sense of self, but not over-identify with the work? So especially when we're working from home, there's that piece around where do I start and where do I finish? And that would be equally valid for if you're working for yourself or if you're working for an organization, the log on, log off, kind of when does that happen in terms of with the clock and with your days. But in terms of navigating that tension, I think, well, a lot of my research has really explored what it is to understand you as a person and you and your kind of strengths and some of your potential derailers. So for example, if you are working in, it's a concept that I'm working on called practice area psychology. So if you're working in a certain area of law, let's say corporate commercial litigation, if that area of law, what attributes of your personality really come to life in that practice of law, and which ones, when overplayed or underplayed, can derail you. And so it's a really acute awareness of your own constitution. So personality is one aspect, and the other one is values. What are my values? What are the value set that I carry with me as a human into the workplace? But also, what are the values that my workplace really cultivates and celebrates? And if you haven't got the alignment of personality and or values with workplace, that's when you're going to start to feel that real jarring. And knowing when it's a tension that's a growth tension versus a this is not right tension, I think is a critical distinction.
Well, that brings to mind many conversations I've had on this podcast. For example, people who have gone into large law firms coming out of law school, but with a very strong ethos of social justice and wanting to do the right thing by the world, and then found that ethos was being crushed by a very rigid structure around them. So there was a misalignment. Or people going into litigation where they really see conflict through a different lens. Or I personally changed from corporate transactions, even though I loved doing corporate transactions, to something that was more advisory, and also working with different kind of clientele, from big corporates more towards smaller ones and social enterprises and not-for-profits. So I guess this practice area psychology concept that you're talking about is it's so vital, yet we tend to see it as through a career lens. When I have conversations with young lawyers who are trying to decide at the end of their training where they're going to settle, as we say in law firms, which part of the firm am I going to settle in? I'm looking at this career for the next 30 years or so. Am I going to be a litigator, or am I going to be a corporate transaction lawyer, or whatever, workplace lawyer, etc.? It's done through such a transactional lens, like what's going to serve me best in terms of career progression, rather than what's going to actually satisfy me the most and what aligns most with my purpose, which means that at that early stage, we should be applying your concepts of practice area psychology, as well as teaching people well-being awareness so that they understand what actually makes them happier. I think that's an obvious outcome, but so missing.
I agree that it seems obvious. And then, things that seem obvious are sometimes, they're light bulb moments, or sometimes they're hidden beneath norms and cultures that don't really embrace kind of what that would look like to play it out. And you'd need to really work in a supportive environment within, let's go for that more traditional kind of legal workplace, like a big law or a big firm, to really embrace that way of even being at work. And I'm really fortunate that I'm aligned with Minds Count. I'm not sure if you're aware of this body, but they have 13 workplace factors that they have put together for law firms to adopt and be signatories to support kind of the what it is to really cultivate and nurture lawyer wellbeing at work. And so this is a foundation that I'm a signatory to, and there's some great resources online. Maybe I can pop it in a link or something. Yeah, so there's a foundation that's really committed to having, like I said, a bit of a signatory based who wants to sign up to this way of living and working in the legal world. And that's the first step, right? That's, recognizing that we want to align with that. The challenge is, how do we actually live that out? How do we bring that to our people? How do we activate that in our culture? How do we create leadership standards and wellbeing practices and ways of working that are aligned with that, so that it's not just lip service? And so, like I said before, that piece around knowing your own constitution, kind of as a lawyer, I think is a part of it. You need to have responsibility for yourself and the environment that you put yourself in, but then also organizations need to have a responsibility as well, in terms of they could be signing up or they could be endorsing a better way of doing and practicing that legal culture. So that's kind of the individual and the organizational lens. But I want to go back to expand on what you said about the practice area psychology, because I think it's really vital that, in addition to you as a lawyer showing up and being kind of a human being and showing up in your work, the actual practice area that you choose, like you said, Geraldine, will have its own idiosyncrasies and its own tests and challenges and its own silver linings and kind of bright days and dark days. And so I think what's really interesting to explore is, what am I signing up for, not just in the work, but in the culture, in the norms, the narrative exist there in this system. So yes, I might be really analytical. I might be really good at putting together cohesive and robust arguments. I might be really detail oriented, other features that can really stoke your ability to perform and succeed in the world of work and in the legal profession. But what am I signing up for in terms of the norms, and how are those norms changing, or how do I want to influence those norms? So there's some pretty radical and pretty cool, innovative law firms out there at the moment who are really shaking things up, and also legal communities where you can join and as a collective, rather than feeling in a silo in this endeavor. So I think, the lawyer themselves, but then also the legal practice. So what sometimes I refer to as, because my perspective is normally informed by a wellbeing approach, is I talk about lawyer wellbeing, which is the individual, and then legal wellbeing, which is what it's like to actually practice in that area of law, not just for you, but for the clients, for the culture, for the organization. And I know Kim Wright, who is wonderful, kind of has her views on how the law impacts society. So that's more that pocket that I'm really honing in on, as opposed to the individual lawyer, which has its own kind of body of knowledge around what it is to succeed, what the derailers are, and what some of those risk factors could be, because we know burnout and some other mental health experiences can be really quite, if not attended to, damaging over the prospect of a whole career span.
So it strikes me that this concept of lawyer know thyself is quite important, and the earlier you can cultivate it, probably the more satisfied you're going to be as a lawyer, but also the more positive impact one would hope you'd have on the world, that legal well-being part. Is there a connection between the work you're doing in yoga teacher training in terms of developing that sort of awareness in a person?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that into the conversation, Geraldine. I'm in my teacher training at the moment, which I'm just absolutely loving, and it's such an intentional space that I'm moving into as well, taking on that extra. Yes, it's a credential of, it's a certain path that I'm choosing to go down. But for me, just to wind it back before I answer the questions, so that we can understand the context that that comes to support kind of the work that I am doing more holistically now. For me, kind of yoga was a little bit of a self-care routine from a young age. It was a great way to ground. It was a great way to kind of get into my body, and it felt good. It was like some kind of I didn't really understand it, but it felt really good while I was practicing, and I felt really good afterwards. So it was like that for like maybe 5 years or so. Then when I decided to take a deep inquiry into psychology and really pursue that as a career pathway, I saw it as more of a study of mind. So we add on an extra layer now. So we've already got the body piece, at least for me. It was like, yep, yoga's about the body and the asana. Now it's okay, yep, yoga's about the mind and how we still the mind, and there's mindfulness and meditation that comes in. So that's like the second layer. We've got the body, then we've got the mind. And then the last years I've really been focusing on breath. And so kind of mind, body, and breath, and the interconnectedness of those three pieces. So the pranayama, the energy, the movement, how we harness that, how we practice that, the techniques, the art, the skillful means involved in that, has been the latest kind of, and I think probably that kind of final sheath that goes on top. Because for me, if we're not connecting with our body, our mind, and our breath, our well-being, really, we're not harnessing the best of our well-being. And so for yoga is really now, for me personally, more of a way of life rather than a kind of, we said, it's a pathway, but it's a way of being in the world. And what's really interesting is, I mentioned the environmental dimension of wellbeing earlier. We're actually starting to implement more breathing practices in the wellbeing work that we do in the corporate and commercial worlds. So we're finding that while the science, people get really comforted by the science of breathing, the act of, for example, every workshop we do, we start with a breathing exercise. The act of breathing and getting into our breath takes us into our body and settles our mind. And so I know there's so many great practitioners out there who are working at that intersection of law and psychology and other intersections that involve spirituality. But for me, there's that big piece around how do we harness what we've got? Like this, all we've got at the end of the day is who we are and how we show up. So how do we bring our it's a bit kind of trite to say how do we bring our best selves, but how do we bring our whole selves in a way that we feel embodied, and really all those interconnected pieces of our mind, body, and breath can help us show up when we need to.
I feel like you're hitting on something that I'm seeing a lot of in spiritual communities, which is the realization that we are our bodies. That we'd emphasize so much on the spiritual part that we, at the cost of looking after our bodies, when in fact the body, as you said, is how we are, who we are, in a sense. This is how we interact with the world. It's actually a wonderful insight. Thank you.
And Geraldine, there's something else to build on with that, because I'm so glad that it's striking something for you that's resonating. One of the, I guess you would say teachers, kind of in that more Buddhist domain of my life, has written, kind of really made a stand about what it is to be and the two types of being. So she calls it little b being and big B being, which we love. And so the little b being, as she talks about it, and this is the way that really resonates for me, little b being is that that more presence piece, what it is to be right now, you and I in a conversation, I'm fully here and I'm being here. And the big B is the piece around, I'm a human being. I need to acknowledge that, and I think one of the risks that's happened when we've turned to a virtual world is we feel like floating heads. We feel like, where is the rest of our body? When we're in the physical world, we're commuting. If we're talking in front of people, we have body language, we have all this physicality involved. But when we're reduced to, we're necessarily reduced to a square, it's like a floating head. Where is the rest of my body? I often ask people a pretty disarming question in workshop, like, are you wearing shoes, or how are you sitting right now? Because I'm really curious, what are you doing with the rest of your body? Because we kind of have a, what's the word? we've outsourced like everything, and we're just this, mind and a worker, and we're in this, we're in the rat race, we're doing it, we're really here. But what about the rest of us? What happens when the screen goes off? I think that's a really interesting question we should be asking ourselves.
That's an interesting point, that work from home and working remotely and doing everything online has narrowed the concept of the worker even more in some ways to that little box. So long as from your waist up you're presentable, then that's fine, and the rest of it can be ignored, which means that that's an even smaller space that we're working on than we used to when we were going to the office or going to our workplaces. I hadn't thought of that. That's a very interesting perspective. Emily, I knew this would be a fascinating conversation. It really has. We've touched on so much, and there have been so many interesting ideas that you've given me and anyone who's listening to this and watching this. I was going to ask you, the human link, does it work mainly with organizations or individuals? If people are interested in coming to you for more on what you've talked about, which has been so rich, can you counsel individuals in trying to find, work through practice area psychology and work on their legal well-being versus lawyer well-being?
Yeah, definitely. We're very open to have conversations about where that might fit for you. You might kind of come to us with one idea and we might expand that for you. So there's that. I'm also happy to have conversations that are more aligned with the spiritual side of things, which is a bit more about my personal work and that yoga space that I occupy. So very happy to have a workplace or a bit more of a personal conversation. And if I can, Geraldine, I'd love to just suggest a couple of resources that people might like to access as well that would build and kind of broaden the way in which I've been tapping into a few themes today. There's a wonderful organisation called the Institute for Wellbeing in Law. Now, they are a US-based kind of outfit, and I'm a committee member there. And they are doing amazing work, and they have identified spiritual wellbeing as one of the aspects of a lawyer's overall wellbeing kind of constitution. So if people are interested to read a bit more about what's happening there, and it's they've done some really robust studies and there's some good stuff there, that's one of them. And the other one is there was an excellent journal that was published last year called The Humanistic Psychologist. So that was an American Psychological Association endorsed publication, and they really do a big examination of what it is to look into mindfulness from a Buddhist and contemporary perspective. And there's just some gem articles in there if you are drawn to the science and you'd like to read a little bit more about what's happening in this space academically or at a more scientific level. There's some amazing articles in there as well. So I just wanted to throw those out there in case people wanted to do some further reading.
Sure, I'll add the links to the webpage and on YouTube so people can easily access them. Resources are always helpful, so thank you for that. Thank you for sharing your time with us and your insight. I just love how you've thought about all of these different perspectives that seem so sort of woolly, but you've actually really carefully listed them and categorized them, but yet in a way where the dynamism between the concepts is easily captured. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Geraldine. I think it's that multidisciplinary approach that comes out when you've been trained in more than one field. You get to really play at the intersections and bring across methodologies and put them together in wonderful ways. Thanks for your excellent questions today, Geraldine, as well.